They found him on a Sunday afternoon, a small body folded like a sentence that had been cut short. The playground swings moved in the slow rhythm of a town that still believed itself safe, the chain links clinking in the dry late summer wind. And the house on Elm Street smelled faintly of coffee and gasoline. Neighbors said later that everyone who lived in that small Ogden cul-de-sac felt, for a moment, that the world had slipped a little off its hinges. Before we dive deeper, take a second to subscribe to Calis-Crime Vault and smash the like button. It's much appreciated. And keep these stories coming your way. Drop your state in the comments below and let me know where you're watching from. Andy, someone whispered at first, as if saying his name could change where he was. By the time the first patrol car rolled up, blue lights slicing the dusty sunlight, a crowd had gathered. Women in polyester and men with hands in their pockets. Faces that would never forget the way the air held its breath that day. A policeman pulled back the caution tape, and a detective pulled on gloves, as if conducting a ritual to bring order to something that had no sense of order left. The case file would later be labeled with neat, official words. Utah 1977 cold case solved. But in the weeks and months that followed, it was simply the thing everybody in town had to talk around. At church suppers, at the grocery store, over backyard fences. It was the name on the tip of everyone's tongue, and the thing no one wanted to say out loud. Andy Braun was 8 years old. He loved baseball cards and the way his mother folded his shirts. He had a laugh that was loud for such a small boy, and a particular reverence for the backyard ficus tree where he pretended to be a pirate captain. The boys on his block remembered him as the kid who always wanted one more turn on the bike. The sadness of his absence managed in the most ordinary ways to make the town feel younger and older at the same time. The first narrative that took hold was the one people wanted: an accident. Children played unsupervised, and a gun went off. Tragedy. It's how communities make sense of the incomprehensible. Quick, clean words that let worry retreat back into the background. Souls could wrap themselves in that tidy explanation and sleep. But as the weeks of 1977 passed and detectives flipped through witness statements and family interviews, that tidy explanation started to fray. Andy's father, Sheriff Martin Braun, was a 39-year-old career lawman. He'd walked a path of service that was familiar to the town. High school football hero turned deputy, steady in the pews on Sunday, reliable at school board meetings. Being a policeman in Ogden meant you were expected to be careful. It meant your neighbors trusted you with the very thing that, in the end, showed how fragile that trust really was. When officers described the initial scene, they spoke of small human details that painted a picture of a life interrupted rather than a headline. The back door had been unlocked. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the kitchen counter. There were toy cars on the living room floor, tracks of brash, forgotten afternoon. In a bedroom upstairs, among uniform shirts and medals, lay a service pistol in an unlocked drawer. One of the Browning 9mm pistols Martin kept when he came off a shift. That small omission, the absence of a lock, would become the hinge upon which accusation and defense swung. Investigators followed the paths people's lives always take after a violent loss. Statements, alibis, forensic tests rudimentary by today's standards, and the steady, patient process of asking the question why, in every tone they could manage. There were witnesses who said they'd seen the boys that afternoon, rough housing in the yard, sticks like swords. There was the older brother, Tom Braun, then 16, who shrank into himself under the weight of the town's eyes. He had been at the scene, at the house, in the backyard when the thing happened. In 1977, the forensic tool set was smaller. There were no DNA profiles to be run through databases, no cell phone records to map movement. Investigators relied on interviews, patterns, and the kind of gut that comes from years walking the same beat. Yet even without modern science, an officer can tell when a family story is full of holes. They can listen for the tremor that comes when someone says a name. They can observe the small things that don't match up. Martin's statement that he had left the gun in a drawer because he was coming right back was the sort of casual negligence that unspooled into consequence. Rumors did their work fast. Some whispered that Tom had been jealous, that sibling resentment had boiled over. Others insisted it had been a misfire, a tragic mishap during play. There were darker murmurs, too, that Andy had been a target of a shove too far, a taunt that became an accident. Towns fabricate stories to make sense of grief. They need a narrative where someone's intention can be named and judged. The rumor mill turned out versions that couldn't all be true. Detectives did the sober work of ruling things out. They gathered statements from neighbors who'd heard children playing loudly that afternoon, used ballistics reports to confirm a type of weapon, and reconstructed a timeline of the afternoon. The father on duty, then late to return home. The mother at the market steps away. The boys in the yard, booming and oblivious to the thinness of life. Tom, who had always been tall for his age and quiet in a way that people with secrets often are, gave inconsistent answers. At times his voice broke with grief, and at others he was blank as a courtroom bench. His friends said he'd been an uncertain leader among peers, the sort who wanted to be bigger than he was. He loved his brother. He loved his parents. He loved his father's stories of courage at the station. Love, they would learn, does not always prevent harm. When the coroner's report came back, the language was clinical and merciless. Cause of death, a single gunshot wound. No alcohol, no drugs, nothing to complicate a child's absolute vulnerability. The town's sorrow hardened into agitation. The simplest question, where did the gun come from, became the most laden. Martin Braun's defense, when he was eventually arrested for negligence, leaned heavily on guilt's complexity. He was not charged with murder. The evidence did not support the claim that he had intended harm. Instead, he was accused of leaving a loaded firearm accessible in a house with children, a dereliction of the duty that his profession required of him. The badge of a policeman carries expectations, and the weight of those expectations is particularly heavy when the emergency is inside one's own walls. The arrest reverberated. It was one thing for a private citizen to be negligent. It was another for a man sworn to protect his town to be charged with the simplest, most human failure. The courtroom was packed on the day the charges were read. The press called it an arrest that shocked the community, because trust, once cracked, always makes a loud noise. People took sides. Some saw a tragic mistake, punishment too cruel on a grieving father. Others clicked their tongues with the steadiness of a moral measure. A person with a weapon must be more careful. But a trial is not just moral posturing. It is a slow, surgical excavation of a life. Witnesses were called. Schoolmates described Tom's mood that summer, quieter than usual, sometimes withdrawn. Neighbors testified to seeing the boys playing, Tom in the lead on most occasions. The prosecution painted a picture of negligence, a pistol left unlocked, a father too confident in routines, an adolescent with access and not enough supervision. Defense lawyers focused on the frailty of accident, on human fallibility. They called character witnesses for Martin, colleagues who attested to a lifetime of service and prudence. They suggested the tragedy could have happened in 100 different ways, none of them the result of criminal intent. Court transcripts would later reveal long pauses and shorter sentences. He loved his boys, someone would say, the words like a benediction. In the public sphere, love and culpability tangled like the roots of an old tree, impossible to untangle without destroying the tree. As the drama unfolded, the town's chatter grew more pernicious in some corners. Eyewitnesses began to remember things they hadn't before. Memory is a strange beast. Under pressure, people reconstruct events to fit narratives they've convinced themselves are true. Old friends who had once defended Tom's temperament found themselves leaning into the idea that he had been the type to act rashly. The children who'd played nearby were interviewed again and again. Repetitive process that can turn suggestion into conviction. Then, Years into the investigation, an eyewitness came forward whose words would tilt the trajectory of the case. She was a neighbor, Mrs. Harlan, who had been reluctant to get involved at the beginning, not wanting to draw attention to herself. In private, she had been a woman of small kindnesses and large prayers, someone who knitted for the church and remembered birthdays with cards folded in neat script. When she finally spoke to detectives, she said she'd heard a sound that day, a distinct angry argument between two boys, and then later, a single sharp sound. Her account contained a detail that no one else had reported, a frightened whisper from Tom, the older brother, pleading about the gun. She recalled, with a clarity that years sometimes polish, that she had seen Tom running from the yard with his shirt rimmed with dust and a look that suggested panic, not play. To investigators, Mrs. Harlan's memory added a human timbre that made the otherwise clinical facts feel even more immediate. Tom was a boy who carried so much, she told detective. You could see it in the way he walked. He wasn't ready for what he was carrying. That testimony did not bring answers as much as it changed how the story was told. The narrative that took hold in town now had more texture, not only an unlocked gun and a negligent father, but scared, perhaps overwhelmed adolescent in the eye of a small domestic storm. The oldest truth, that a life had been extinguished, remained. The newer truths complicated it. As years passed, Ogden endured. People moved away, and others moved in. But every so often, the case circulated back to life, like a bruise that doesn't quite heal. Cold case detectives sifted through old boxes, leafed through faded reports, and re-interviewed people whose memories had shifted with time. The job of a cold case investigator is partly archaeology and partly faith. You go back to the ground to see if anything new will come to light. There were moments when the case nearly closed and moments when it almost vanished entirely. In the late 80s, a defense attorney argued the chain of custody for a piece of evidence was compromised. In the mid-90s, a journalist produced a feature that reminded people of the boy who had been loved and of the family broken by the event. The town rarely agreed on one version, but it always agreed on the grief. The truth, when it finally arrived in the form that made prosecution possible, was not a clean confession, but a concatenation of small, damning admissions. That the gun had been left unlocked, that the boys had known where it was stored, that Tom had brought it outside as a show of bravado, and then panic turned the afternoon into catastrophe. Evidence, witness testimony, and the cumulative weight of contradictions converged to a point where charging Martin for negligence felt not punitive, but perhaps necessary to make sense of the moral ledger. When arrests were made, the courtroom again became the place where private sorrow met public judgment. Testimonies were read back. The neighbor who'd peeked through curtains, a friend who had heard the boys, the paramedic who had knelt on the lawn and tried in vain to hasten life back into a boy who had nowhere left to go. Tom's statements to the police, dotted with the stutters of a teenager thrust into adult consequences, were played and replayed. The prosecution threaded a narrative that suggested a failure of responsibility by an adult sworn to protect, a loaded service weapon left where anyone could reach it. But law and morality are cousins that do not always hold hands. There was a human cost in convicting a man who once protected the town, whose whole identity had been tied into the badge he wore. There was also a profound moral demand to reckon with how a child's life could be taken by such a small, preventable action. Ogden had to choose which hurt it would honor. The courtroom drama was not all witnesses and evidentiary exhibits. There were scenes small and sharp with emotion. A mother's hand trembling on a pew. Tom, older now, his jaw thicker, his eyes hollowed by years, standing when his name was called, voice barely above a breath as he answered. The father, Martin, who had once held the community's trust, sitting with hands folded, sometimes staring at the floor as if the wooden grain held answers. Members of the public murmured, as if the sound could change the facts. What complicated everything further were the confessions, not formal admissions of intent to kill, but smaller, human concessions made to friends and to priests in confessionals. Tom confessed years later in the privacy of a church office to a memory he could not bear, that he had pointed the gun at his brother, thinking it was empty, and in a moment that he described as nothing but stupid bravado and terrible curiosity, the mechanism had flashed life. He said he had been a boy who wanted to look brave in front of friends, and had not known the weight of a trigger until the weight had been irreversible. The brother's confession shook the town not because it had been absent. Curious boys with guns are a tale often told, but because it contained a human detail that made it unbearable, an admission that innocence and cruelty can live inside the same pulse. Tom's words were an attempt at truth-telling that required him to live with the knowledge for the rest of his life. They were not an absolution. They were a small, honest thing in a morass of lies, rumors, and protective silences. There were legal consequences for Martin and for the system that allowed the weapon to be accessible. He was arrested, tried, and convicted of criminal negligence, not because he wanted his son dead, but because the law had to assign accountability where a state of preventable risk existed. The town's response was fractured. Some called for leniency and pointed to Martin's years of service, offering petitions and letters of support. Others argued that the law must be blind when the harm was foreseeable. In this uneasy balance, sentences were handed down, appeals were filed, and the human ravages of guilt played out in small domestic ways. A mother breaking down in public, siblings who no longer sat at the same Christmas table, a house that hummed with a silence louder than any argument. Yet even after the legal system issued its verdicts, life did not snap back to place. Judgment did not satisfy. People who had once stood as pillars of the community found themselves spoken about in hushed tones. Children who had survived the same events carried a different kind of inheritance, a story they would take into their own families like a cautionary tale. It's important, when telling this kind of story, to remember the human faces behind the facts. Andy's mother, whose name appears in interviews in hushed tones, would say nothing in long public statements. She moved away, as if distance could make grief easier to hold. Martin, when he finally spoke years later, said the thing that all of us who love imperfectly want to say, that there are no words big enough for the regret he felt. Tom, for his part, lived with his confession the way some people live with an ache, as a part he could not excise, never quite able to look at himself without the shadow of that afternoon. Communities heal in odd ways. In this town, healing came in the form of new laws and more rigorous training on firearm storage, in conversations in schools about safety, in churches offering grief counseling. But healing did not erase the memory. It only carved a path through it so the living could pass. The case, Utah 1977 cold case solved, became a phrase used not as a headline, but as a cautionary marker. It became the title of a better practice. Lock your guns, talk to your kids. Never let the tools that kill be toys for the young. Even as the official files closed, questions remained. Was Tom fully truthful in his confessions? Were there things that fear and shame had obscured? Did the town politicize grief in ways that made justice feel like punishment? The answers are never neat. People who lived through it carried conflicting memories. Some believed wholeheartedly that truth had come out. Others thought the system had forced a narrative onto a messy human failure. The documentary voice in a video like this must be careful to describe without exploitation. People are not plot points, and a child's death is not a dramatic twist meant to spike numbers. The story of Andy Braun is one of consequence. It shows how small decisions, a gun left unlatched, a hush that prevents conversation about danger, a society that normalizes risky behaviors in the name of toughening boys, can cascade into irreversible tragedy. It's a story about community, about trust, about the fragile architecture of domestic safety. Years later, Tom would sometimes be seen in the outskirts of town, older and quieter, working in a job that kept his head down. People who met him rarely spoke of that afternoon. He was no villain in a black hat. He was a man who had grown under a long, bitter shadow. He volunteered sometimes at youth programs that taught gun safety, perhaps trying to repair the ripples his actions had caused. Whether that is redemption is not a question for legal judgment, but for the slow arithmetic of human reconciliation. The court transcripts, the neighbors' notes, the interviews, they form the bones of the story. But bones do not tell the ache. Only living people do. Andy's mother kept a small photograph of her boy in a wallet for decades, a picture of a gap-toothed smile. Friends of Andy's described nights when they would find themselves whispering his name in parks where boys still played. It is in these private recollections that the emotional truth of the case sits. A small boy loved, a family shifted, a town changed. As the story of the Utah 1977 cold case settled into library drawers and newspaper archives, it also settled into the ways people spoke to their children about responsibility. In many homes in Utah and across the country, locked boxes and conversations about what a firearm is and is not became more common. Parents began to ask themselves harder questions about what safety looks like in a world that sometimes asks boys to act older than they are. When documentary filmmakers returned to Ogden for new interviews, they found people who had aged with the case. Some wanted to speak on camera, others did not. The director would later say that the hardest part was balancing truth with tenderness, telling what happened without using a child's sorrow as fodder. The interview with Mrs. Harlan, the neighbor who'd first admitted she'd seen panic that afternoon, was one of the most moving. She talked about the smell of cut grass, the slice of sunlight on the porch, and the way small things, a dropped toy, a closed shutter, took on the weight of prophecy in the hours and days after the shooting. The hardest part, she said into the microphone, voice steady from years of prayer, was knowing the sound you hear when a child is gone. It's a sound that never stops if you let it in. And that is the bitter sweetness of telling this story. If you let it in, it never stops. The town never fully closes the door on it. The family never entirely moves past the day when ordinary life became something else. The legal outcome did not return a life, nor did it alleviate the complicated responsibility borne by an entire community that had once put its safety in the hands of a man now judged for his negligence. So where does closure lie in a story like this? The trial delivered a verdict. The town issued its judgment in countless private ways. But closure is not a legal phenomenon alone. It is a social, emotional, and spiritual one. For some, closure meant the sentence. For others, it meant quiet, personal acts. Planting a tree in a boy's memory, teaching safety in his name, or finally telling a truth that had been shoved into the dark. The final scene of our episode, and the cliffhanger that will carry viewers forward, is this. Decades after the shooting, a sealed journal appears during an estate clearing of a distant relative. Its pages are worn thin, and inside is a note not of confession but of a detail previously unknown to investigators. A children's game that had been played in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, one that attempted to mimic police procedure, with roles assigned and boundaries blurred. The journal doesn't absolve or convict. Instead, it offers context, a small, human thing that suggests the boys had been experimenting with adult roles, with authority, with objects they didn't understand. The discovery prompts a new question. How much of tragedy is made of single careless acts? And how much is the product of a culture that socializes boys into dangerous mimicry without giving them the tools to navigate consequence? If an unlocked gun is negligence, what is a culture that teaches boys to perform violence as play? That journal, like so many artifacts, raises more questions than it answers. It offers a path for a follow-up episode, one that will explore the social currents of mid-1970s Utah, the ways children imitate the roles of mentorship and instruction, and whether prevention might have been possible through different community choices. The camera fades on the town's quiet streets, on the backyard where a small ficus tree still grows, ringed now by a makeshift fence. A father walks past, holding his son's hand. In the background, voices carry on, softened by the evening. The closing line we leave you with is simple. In a place where a single unlocked drawer changed everything. The work of keeping children safe is no one person's alone. It is the work of all of us, policymakers, parents, neighbors, and friends. Next time, we return to the journal, to the voices of the boys who grew up in that neighborhood, and to the question no one has yet fully answered. What prevents a simple, preventable tragedy from happening again? We pick up the story where the journal is found. Brittle pages, a child's looping hand turned inward on itself like a secret. The discovery rippled through Ogden, not because anyone expected an answer, but because old wounds have a way of reopening when you think you finished with them. Documentarians called it a promising lead. City officials called it an unwelcome reminder for the families who had never stopped lying awake at night. It was another summons to remember. They opened the journal in the sterile light of the Historical Society's reading room, pages rustling like ghosts. The entries at first were small, descriptions of games and dares, lists of neighborhood kids, names crossed out and annotated. Then, tucked between sketches of backyard forts and half-finished plans for a secret club, was an account of play that read differently than a story about boys pretending. It described rules for a police game, roles, a mock trial, a weapon kept in a drawer, and a reputation to uphold. The handwriting was not Andy's. It was older, more controlled. A neighbor teen's attempt at organizing fun. But the words were telling. They showed how the shape of an afternoon could become dangerous, even when no one meant for harm. A producer on the documentary called the local cold case unit. Detectives who had long since closed the file came back to a house they knew by memory. New forensics, the discipline of interviewing adults with fresh psychological techniques, and the patience of people who had spent careers reading between lines were brought to bear. They were careful not to sensationalize the journal's content. It did not, by itself, convict anyone of anything. But people who study violence and prevention understand that context matters. When children are taught to perform adult roles without adult boundaries, when a culture confuses toughening up with risk, accidents are more likely to become tragedies. Investigators began by re-interviewing the boys who'd been around that summer. They were men now with jobs, gray at temples, and eyes that flicked away when the past crept near. Some were cooperative, others shut down. Memory, they learned, is a collaborative enterprise between what happened and what people need to believe happened. Statements shifted. A play that once seemed innocent now appeared, in hindsight, reckless. A moment that had seemed inconsequential to a 12-year-old now carried the weight of adult regret. One interview stood out. Michael Reyes, short, wiry, once a neighborhood instigator, remembered a day when a young man from the sheriff's office had come by to show kids around the patrol car. Michael's memory placed the man's visit 2 weeks before Andy's death. He joked about a gun being heavy, Michael told the detective. He let us hold it unloaded, right there on the lawn. It was like a magic trick. He made it seem safe because he said we were police kids. That passing demonstration, remembered now, was not malicious. It was paternalistic. An adult sharing his world with children, showing them a badge and a gun as if the objects were trophies. The problem, when adults normalize dangerous things without setting clear boundaries, is that children learn a false confidence. The journal's pages showed how layers of mimicry, roles performed at home, games at school, an adult's jovial demonstration, build to a dangerous belief that some objects are harmless in the right hands. As interviews accumulated, patterns emerged that were small but significant. Guns sometimes sat unlocked in homes where fathers worked in law enforcement. Kids in the neighborhood had once been invited to ride along in patrol cars, and there was a casual attitude toward weapons couched in a language of training and responsibility. A culture of trust in fathers and the badge, in how things are done, had softened the boundaries that should have protected children. The documentary team juxtaposed these modern interviews with archival footage, home movies of block parties, shaky film of neighborhood baseball games, and photographs of young men in uniform. Watching the images, the town could see itself. Friends' Sunday barbecues, a community that looked out for one another. But watching was not the same as feeling the weight of what those images implied when paired with the journal's brutal truth. The deeper investigation was not aimed at scapegoating. It was aimed at understanding. Why had a loaded service pistol been within reach in a home where a policeman lived? Why had no one thought to ask if boys knew where the drawer was? Why did a culture of permissiveness toward children's toughness take precedence over the small, technical act of securing a lethal object? Answers were complex. There were bureaucratic inanities, a department that discouraged officers from appearing weak by overemphasizing self-reliance, a neighborhood where boasting about boys who were tough earned social capital, and perhaps most perniciously, a community-wide blindness to the possibility that those entrusted to protect could also make catastrophic mistakes. The journal did not sing a single villain. It described a chorus of bad micro-decisions that in aggregate created a dangerous ecosystem. On camera, the men who'd once been boys rehearsed in stilted phrases the impact that culture had on them. "We thought guns were part of growing up," one said. "We thought being brave meant showing you could handle them." The admission was quiet, but the implication thundered. Bravery and competence are learned through safe, supervised practice, not through improvisation. As the documentary's research deepened, so did the town's unease. People who had long taken pride in their trust to first responders now saw how that trust could be misapplied in private life. For families who had lost a child, the journal's discovery reopened fresh grief and new questions. For others, it was a rallying point. Public forums were held, parents demanded better safety regulations, and the sheriff's office, the very institution at the heart of the story, agreed to internal audits and mandatory firearm safety courses for its members. The narrative that had once closed around the idea of an unfortunate accident began to spread into a broader, more painful frame. This was not simply the story of one gun and one careless moment. It was a story about how a culture allowed dangerous mimicry and risky practices to go unexamined. The town's original version of the event, tidy, singular, solved, unraveled into something messier and more systemic. For some, that was a relief. At least complexity acknowledged there was more to fix. For others, it was punishment to have the past reopened. Yet even as community forums and safety initiatives proliferated, the journal had more to say. Tucked to the back were names of other boys, a list with dates, and a shorthand that suggested something darker than a list of friends. The list included a name that made one detective's blood run cold. Eddie Hale, July 1969. The name meant nothing at first to the casual reader, but to the detective who had grown up in the area, it meant a case that had never been resolved. Eddie Hale was a boy who had vanished for a few weeks in the summer of '69, then been found after a short search, largely unharmed, with a story the town accepted. He'd wandered off and come back. No crime was alleged at the time, and Eddie grew up with a streak of quiet oddness, a rumor-scarred childhood that never fully healed. The mention in the journal suggested a connection that had never been considered. Perhaps Eddie's wandering off hadn't been as innocent as people assumed. Perhaps the neighborhood's pattern of adult-led play had produced more than one close call. The detective reopened old boxes from the county archives, dusting off an old missing persons report from 1969. It was astonishing how quickly the old paper trail could be peeled back. A neighbor's note, a sheriff's memo, a testimony that had been filed away. What had been written then was thin, polite, and relieved when Eddie returned. At the time, the town wanted closure more than scrutiny. A returned child was a happy ending, so they settled on the simplest story. But the journal's mention of Eddie introduced doubt. What if Eddie's disappearance had been another signal muffled by time and embarrassed pride? Investigators interviewed Eddie in a nursing home after a nervous call. He was older now, his sharpness dulled by age, but the eyes still curious. Eddie remembered a summer day, with gaps he had never been able to explain. He spoke haltingly about directionless boys, an adult who taught them to be like the men, and a pickup truck that smelled of motor oil and cigarettes. He admitted, in a voice that trembled with decades of unsaid things, that he had felt scared that summer and had not wanted to tell anyone. "We were supposed to be tough," he said, "and when we weren't, we were ashamed." Eddie's memory added a new, unsettling layer. The town's past was littered not only with a single tragedy, but with almost tragedies, moments that could have turned fatal, and, in some cases, nearly had. The fact that they hadn't been fatal did not make them less serious. The presence of multiple near misses suggested a pattern of permissiveness and an unexamined risk culture. The town's narrative shuddered under the weight of this broader context. The documentary that grew out of these findings was careful. Filmmakers resisted the siren call of sensational accusation. They were not prosecutors. Instead, they aimed to map a culture, to show how small choices created conditions for harm. They interviewed sociologists, pediatricians, firearm safety experts, and men who had once been boys in that neighborhood. They staged reenactments to illustrate how mimicry and machiness could normalize dangerous behavior. The film's tone was forensic and sympathetic, never exploitative. And yet, no amount of careful framing could mute the community's desire for a dramatic resolution. People wanted a culprit, a single person to blame. The human brain aches for simplicity. The documentary's producers resisted that urge. They kept asking the hard question: if this was a cultural failing, who bears responsibility? Individuals? Institutions? Everyone? Then, as investigators combed the attic of an elderly former deputy who had once worked under Martin Braun, they found a faded shoebox. Inside were Polaroids, blurry, sun-faded images of boys on a lawn, officers with hands on shoulders, guns held at awkward angles, smiles that made the pictures look like celebrations. In one photo, the deputy, now deceased, posed with a gaggle of kids, a pistol resting on the hood of a car. In the corner of that image, something else caught the eye: a small wooden toy, carved in the shape of a ship. The same toy appeared in a photograph with Andy's family in the archives. The Polaroids were not proof of intent. They were documentation of a culture. But context matters. The detective who held them felt the weight of years of deferred attention slamming into the present. Why had no one asked what was happening in those photos? Why had prudence yielded to performance? The town divided. Some residents demanded accountability for those officers who had encouraged dangerous role play. Others argued that the photos represented moments of goodwill misread by present-day minds. The sheriff's office instituted reforms. Some retired deputies issued apologies. Some did not. Just as the documentary seemed to be steering into policy territory: safer storage laws, mandatory training, parent education. The investigation turned toward something that nobody in the room had expected: names on the journal that matched a string of brief, anonymous letters sent to families in the neighborhood years earlier. The letters had been dismissed back then as the pranks of kids. Now re-examined with adult eyes, they read differently. They were warnings. The letters said in clumsy handwriting, "Stop teaching them like this, and we see you." They had been unsigned, and for decades, they had been a curiosity. Who had written them, and to whom had they referred? A retired librarian who'd kept a file of local curiosities remembered the letters and recalled the return address on one envelope: a vacant lot now turned into townhouses. The detective visited the site, knelt in the dirt, and began to dig in a place where grass had been sown over old foundations. It felt like an act out of a novel. If evidence could sleep a long time beneath roots and mulch, perhaps something would wake it. They found a rusted tin under a slab of concrete, a small container where someone had hidden secrets. Inside was a single photograph folded carefully. A picture of a boy with his mouth open in a laugh, a group of older boys behind him, and an officer with a hand on a pistol. The exact angle of the toy ship photograph. There was also a scrap of paper with a name. Do not trust Martin Braun at home. The name hit like a stone dropped into water. Somebody had objected at the time, tried to warn. Why had no one listened? Why had the letter been buried, literally and metaphorically? The tin's discovery forced a re-examination of old conclusions. The evidence suggested more than negligence. It suggested knowledge and concern from within the community that had been ignored or silenced. People who had long defended the family quietly admitted they had seen things they did not speak about. The reasons for silence were familiar: loyalty, fear of rocking the boat, deference to authority. The town's moral mosaic revealed a pattern: complicity by omission. Public outrage swelled. The documentary's screening room that night was full: neighbors, descendants, retired deputies, and young parents. When the footage rolled, the Polaroids, the journal readings, the neatly staged reenactments, there were audible gasps. For many, their image of Ogden as a safe place under the stewardship of men in uniform fractured irrevocably. Then came the twist that stunned everyone. A box of old court documents, found in a courthouse basement during the documentary's research, contained a redacted police memo from 1976, a year before Andy's death. The memo discussed an internal complaint about inappropriate conduct with cadet program participants and named, in an unnamed fashion, a group of officers involved in extracurricular youth outreach. The complaint had been quietly dismissed after a meeting in which reputational risk was expressed as the primary concern. The memo was marked closed. The reasons given were bland: insufficient evidence, no corroborating witness. But with the journal, the Polaroids, a buried letter, and the new interviews, the memo no longer seemed like an isolated administrative note. It looked, instead, like a paper hinge connecting behavior that had been complained about to behavior that had been normalized. The revelation made national news. It became not just an Ogden story, but an American one about how institutions handle internal complaints. People asked how many other towns had similar memos tucked away in basements. The documentary organizers received messages from across the country from people who had grown up in similar neighborhoods, telling of their own close calls. As the pressure mounted, the sheriff's office appointed an independent review board. The board's hearings were public and raw. Testimonies poured in. Former officers who had seen dangerous practices and not spoken. Families who had been shushed, and men who apologized with the kind of words that sounded like they'd been practiced. The town held its breath. Was this going to be a reckoning or a ritual absolution? On the final night of hearings, the town hall packed so tightly that people stood in stairwells and spilled into the parking lot. The board presented a finding that read more like an indictment of culture than of any single individual. There had been a pattern of risky, adult-led mimicry and administrative dismissal that created an environment where a child's access to a lethal object was normalized. The finding recommended systemic changes and suggested the reopening of certain closed investigations. For some, systemic change was too abstract. They wanted names. They wanted criminal charges. The board, constrained by the statute of limitations and the nature of evidence, could not bring the kind of closure many wanted. Instead, their report served as a moral judgment that would hang over the town like a cloud. Then, the chilling final chapter arrived in a way that nobody anticipated. A phone call in the middle of the night to the documentary's director from a man who had been a quiet figure in town for decades, a janitor at the high school named Harold Finch. Harold had no camera presence and preferred to be anonymous, but he had kept, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in a classroom, a box of items kids had found and left behind. He said he had been carrying a guilt he could not explain, and when he looked at the film and the photos, he felt he needed to do something. Harold invited the director to the high school at dawn. He led them to an abandoned storage closet and pried up the floorboard. Beneath it was a shoebox sealed with duct tape. Inside were items that made the air in the room change. A small wooden ship toy with tooth marks, a child's baseball glove, a Polaroid of an older man, identifiable as a past chief of police, sitting with a gun on his lap and a circle of boys around him. But nested beneath these familiar artifacts was something that felt like the final line of a long, dark letter. It was a cassette tape, a medium of a different era, labeled in careful adult pen, "Listen, if anything happens." The director turned pale. Tape recorders were still common then. People made tapes to preserve voices, confessions, and messages meant for the future. What could be on a cassette sealed and hidden for decades? They took the tape to a studio. The hiss and click of old magnetic recording greeted them. The tape's first voice was low, breathy, almost a confession. It belonged to a man whose name had been removed from the public records in a small redaction. The sheriff's name from the era before Martin. Deputy Chief Lyle Harper. The voice on the tape spoke in halting sentences, and as it unfolded, it became clear the recording had been made urgently, as if the speaker suspected his time for speaking was limited. On the tape, while Harper spoke of a pattern he had witnessed, officers joked in locker rooms, took kids for rides, and let them handle service pistols under the pretense of training. He admitted that he had been present when kids sat on laps and posed with guns for pictures. His tone was one of weary resignation. The most devastating line came 3/4 in. "We hid things because reputation mattered more than safety. If we had done the right thing, that boy would be alive." The voice on the tape then said something that no one in the room could have anticipated. "There are others. Not all names are known, but I placed this where someone would find it. If anything ever happens, this is the truth." The tape ended with a long pause and the sound of a chair creaking away. The town was stunned. A recorded admission of institutional neglect, stitched to an instruction to hide it, felt like a hand on the throat of Ogden's illusion of innocence. People listened to the tape in stunned, repeated loops. For some, the tape was closure, an admission from the past that acknowledged the harm done. For others, it was a blow, a recorded truth that made present-day shame unavoidable. The tape's existence energized prosecutors. New inquiries opened, while statutes of limitations and evidentiary hurdles still limited criminal options. The tape's confession prompt led to administrative consequences. A new era of accountability began in the small town. Officers were disciplined, archives were unsealed, and the sheriff's office adopted sweeping reforms. But the ending that followed was not purely legal or procedural. It was human and terrible in a way almost too intimate to bear. On a humid late summer afternoon when the documentary premiered its findings to a packed house, the camera caught a man in the back row. He was not a public official. He was Tom Braun, the boy who had once confessed, now an older man hollowed by private grief. He stood at the end of the screening, walked to the front, and took the microphone with hands that trembled. "I've carried it," he said simply. "I carried it because I thought I owed my father that. I lied to protect him. I shamefully lied to protect him." He told the room, in a voice that was half a whisper and half a howl, but the confession he had made years earlier had been shaped by fear and a desire to keep the family intact, to spare his mother the shame of the department. He admitted that to protect his parents, he had said things he thought allowed the world to sleep. That sleep, he said, had been a communal one built on silence. The stunned silence that followed was a weight in people's chests. People who had once judged out loud swallow their words. Tom's admission did not erase his early responsibility. He had handled the gun and a boy had died. But it did change how the town understood motives, pressures, and the terrible small compromises that protect reputations at the expense of truth. Then, in a moment that felt cinematic and real in its cruelty, another person in the crowd stood. This was Mary Harlan, the neighbor who had first given testimony years before. She held a photograph in her hand, a yellowing snapshot of a summer picnic. She walked forward and set it on the podium. On it was a face they all recognized, a man who had been spoken of respectfully for decades, the retired county judge who had presided over many of the area's children's cases. Mary's hands were steady as she said, "He told me not to say things. He said it would ruin people. He told me to bury it." The room burst like a wound. People who had trusted the judge on the bench watched as the veneer cracked. Mary then made an accusation that had not been publicly articulated. She said she had heard the judge counsel officers to keep the town's name clean and to discourage families from pressing complaints. Whether the judge had done so to protect the court's image, to maintain civic harmony, or from simple cowardice mattered less than the effect. An apparatus of protection for reputation had undermined safety. The county, already under the glare of the documentary, appointed a special prosecutor to review administrative negligence and obstruction of justice. The judge, who had long since retired, faced public censure and investigations into his conduct during the years when complaints had been quieted rather than pursued. For the families, the legal moves were abstract instruments that could never fix loss. But for the town, the cascade of revelations reshaped public life. Schools instituted mandatory safety programs, the sheriff's office reorganized youth outreach, and a new memorial for Andy, a small bench carved with his name and a phrase about the cost of silence, became a place where people came to reflect and to promise prevention. The final scene in the documentary was quiet and, for many, chilling. It was not a courtroom climax with gavel strikes. It was a child, no more than 10, playing beneath the small ficus tree where Andy had once pretended to be a pirate. He laughed with the unself-conscious carelessness of a child. A man older, shaking, with a face carved by remorse, watched from a nearby bench. It was Tom. He did not approach the boy. He sat and wept, not wailing, but leaking grief in small sounds that the camera caught and did not exploit. As the credits rolled, the last title card appeared. The culture of silence can be as lethal as a loaded weapon. Change requires more than laws. It requires courage to speak, to act, and to protect the most vulnerable among us. The town of Ogden changed in small and large ways after that. Policies and trainings were one measure of progress. The other was intangible, a cultural conversation about what it means to teach boys to be men without glorifying danger, and what it means for adults to be honest when their institutions fail. Some people never forgave the men who had kept quiet. Others offered forgiveness they said was for themselves, not for those they forgave. But the story's final shock, the ending that stunned everyone, came weeks after the documentary aired. In a way, neither the producers nor the community expected. A small package arrived at the Historical Society, returned to sender by courier with no note. Inside was a single object, a child's baseball glove, its leather cracked, and stitched inside it, a scrap of paper. On it, in a child's uneven hand, were words that made the hair rise on the back of every neck who read them. We weren't playing. The simplicity of the note was devastating. It suggested that underlying the entire culture of mimicry and pretend was, in a few dark hearts, an actual intention not of play, but of testing limits. The note did not name names. It offered no motive, no confession that could be prosecuted. It was only evidence of something colder, that among the routines of neighborhood games and adult demonstrations, someone had been practicing real force, and that a child's life had been lost not only to negligence, but perhaps to a cruelty that hid behind the game. The town had expected a tidy end, an explanation, a reform, a way to seal the file. What they received instead was an uncomfortable truth, that the past is a tangle of human motives, some protective, some cowardly, some aggressive, and that the work of safety is never complete. Communities are built on trust, and trust can be betrayed in quiet ways that only decades can reveal. The last frame, both to the documentary and to the story we're telling now, lingers on the bench by the ficus tree. A plaque reads Andy's name. A small wooden ship toy rests atop the bench, like an altar. Tom walks up, lays down the glove, and places his fingertips on the plaque. He does not speak. The sound is the small wind through leaves, a whisper in a place that once held laughter, and then silence. For the viewer, the final lines are simple and chilling. In a town where children learned to imitate authority without learning to respect danger, one boy's life became the proof of a failure to do both. The community had apologized, reformed, and memorialized. Yet the note in the glove, "We weren't playing," remained unassigned, a rasping, unhealed question in the throat of Ogden that would not settle. And so the story ends not with neat closure, but with a harder thing, a warning. The truth sometimes is that the most shocking revelations are not the ones you can prosecute. They are the ones that make you look at yourself and ask what you would have done differently. In Ogden, the answer would be taught for generations. Lock up the weapons. Teach the children the difference between play and power. Listen when someone says stop. If you watched the documentary and felt anger or sorrow or relief or all of that and more, know that those feelings are part of a town reckoning with itself. The case of Utah 1977 cold case solved did not just resolve a crime. It cracked open a culture and forced a community to accept that the cost of silence can be a life. The final image stays with us, a bench, a toy ship, a name, and those few terrifying words hidden in a glove. The story that shocked the town did not end with the verdict. It ended with the knowledge that vigilance, honesty, and compassion are the only tools that keep children safe. The town moves now with the weight of a long memory and the awkward lightness of a place trying to breathe again. Years after Andy Braun's death and the slow unspooling of the truths that followed, Ogden streets carry both the visible marks of change and the invisible ones that take longer to wear away. Where once neighborhoods shrugged off small risks as rites of passage, there are now locked boxes on porches, conversations at kitchen tables about boundaries and responsibility, and a different, quieter kind of watchfulness at playgrounds and backyards. At the household level, the ruin and repair look intimate and uneven. Martin Braun's family, shattered by grief, fractured by guilt, and finally exposed under public scrutiny, became a mirror for what many families felt in the aftermath. The simultaneous need to grieve privately and to answer publicly. Some members moved away to escape the echo. Others stayed and tried to reweave a life stitched with both apology and penance. Tom, the boy who grew into a man living with one irreversible mistake, took on a new, humble purpose. Teaching gun safety at local programs, volunteering where he could, try in small, consistent acts to translate remorse into prevention. His presence at the bench by the ficus tree, tending the memorial, was the town's thinnest, most human kind of penance. A quiet stewardship of memory that could not be undone by words or rulings. For the city, the case acted as a fulcrum. Institutions that had once been treated as beyond reproach were examined, not with the aim of spectacle, but to understand how policy and culture had failed child. The sheriff's office adopted stricter firearm storage rules for officers' homes. Youth outreach programs were redesigned with outside oversight, and the county instituted clearer channels for filing and following up on complaints. Schools introduced curricular units about safety and consent, about when play stops being play, and how to say no without shame. Those changes were practical, measurable, and important. They were also a public acknowledgement that prevention is possible and that structural adjustments matter. But reform does not erase pain. The community still grapples with the layered grief that survives beyond legal resolutions. On somber anniversaries, people gather at the memorial bench to read Andy's name aloud. Neighbors bring flowers and small toys, gestures that keep the boy's life present instead of letting it be reduced to a cautionary tale. Families who once trusted instinctively now insist on explicit promises. Lock it, tell me if something happens. We don't joke about guns. The language of prevention has moved from a vague sense of caution to specific rituals of safety. And that shift, while necessary, is also a daily reminder of what was lost. Socially, the case forced a reckoning about the town's myths, about toughness, about loyalty, about protecting reputations. People who had been raised to defer to authority learned to ask questions. Elders who had been proud of the way children learned to rough it up had to reconsider which lessons they were passing on. The cultural conversation broadened. Parents, clergy, educators, and law enforcement leaders began to speak publicly about vulnerability, responsibility, and the moral imperative of safeguarding children. Emotionally, the town occupies a complicated middle ground. There are residents who have found a measure of compassion for Martin and Tom, who see them as broken people rather than caricatures. There are others who will never forget the cost, and who view institutional apology and reform as too little. Both reactions are real and valid. The work of living together after a wound like this requires tolerating that tension, holding accountability and mercy in the same breath, even when doing so feels impossible. The documentary, the hearings, the journal, and the buried artifacts did more than reopen an old file. They reanimated a set of conversations that have outlived generations. They changed how the town thinks about the ways adults model behavior for children and about the consequences of silence. The ripple effects extended beyond policy into daily practice. Neighbors checking in with each other more deliberately, youth programs insisting on third-party observers, and social gatherings where the health of a town is measured not by gossip, but by whether adults are willing to look honestly at risk. In short, the era after the cold case was solved is one of guarded reconstruction. Ogden is not the same place it was before the journal surfaced and the tapes were played. Nor, thank God, should it be. The household routines that once allowed a loaded weapon to sit within reach have been altered, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes gratefully. The city has relearned a harder lesson about collective responsibility. Vigilance is not about fear, but about care. Silence is not neutral, but an act that can protect harm as easily as it can protect reputation. What remains most vital is the choice each neighbor makes every day, to speak up when something feels wrong, to lock what should be locked, and to teach young people the difference between imitation and authority. If the legacy of Andy Braun's loss can be measured, it will be by how often the town practices those simple, steady acts of care, and by whether future generations inherit a community that keeps its children safer because it chose, finally, to learn. Before you go, make sure to hit subscribe and share, tap like, and turn on notifications. That way you'll never miss the next mystery solved cold case videos. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.